Hi, this is Kelsey Fikowski, and in this video, we're going to be looking at mainly the events of the American Revolutionary War after Lexington and Concord, along with the Battle of Bunker Hill. So at this point, the Continental Army is in full swing, and they are, doing okay. You had your moral victory at the Battle of Concord, and of course, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was more of a moral victory than anything. But now we are in the full swing of things. There's no going back. We tried the olive branch petition. The king basically, in other words, is saying drop dead. And in the summer of 1776, this is the same summer that you're going to have the official Declaration of Independence, we are going to have the Battle of New York. And you're going to see that the British are going to be moving from Boston and moving this war really into the middle states, a divide and conquer type of strategy. At this point, you have the Continental Army, which is this ragtag group of people trying to stand up to amongst the world's most powerful military at this point. And 32,000 British soldiers are going to descend upon New York. You have the Howe brothers, you have General Howe, as well as Admiral Howe. And you'll see that the British forces are going to be quite successful in terms of pushing the Continental Army back, not only across the Hudson River, as you see on this larger map here, but you're also going to see that they're going to be pushed back into New Jersey and then into Pennsylvania across the Delaware River. So at this point, once you have this retreat of the Continental Army, and again, look at the British forces, especially by sea. You have the Admiral Howe here, and then you also have General Howe being very important in terms of on land, and it's a land and sea assault that's going to be successful. So at this point, in the summer of 1776, things are not going all that well. They go all the way from New York to Pennsylvania. And you'll note that the number of soldiers has fallen by 2/3. You have a number that have retreated or deserted the army. You have a number that died. And again, this is showing that, we're at a very decisive point here where these independence seekers better come up with something. Otherwise, they're going to be really, they're going to be forced to be colonial subjects. And Washington realizes that they're going to need a victory, and that even if you have to fight dirty, then you have to fight dirty. So what Washington is going to eventually do is, at this point in the winter of 1776, 1777, they are camping out in Pennsylvania right across the Delaware River. And this is where they're going to launch a surprise attack. He knew on Christmas Eve, 1776, that certainly the Hessian soldiers, who were these German mercenaries, they were paid by the British Army to fight the war by proxy, would most likely be drunk and really not expect this. This was sort of a dirtier move. But this works. And again, Washington, in his sort of genius, is saying we need a moral victory. And the way to do it, well, even if it's a surprise attack, even if it's, a little underhanded, it needs to be done. And it does work. We see 900 Hessian soldiers taken prisoners, as well as 6 cannons, which was quite significant at this time. But of course, this is where you're going to get this very infamous painting here. Certainly Washington looking very heroic. This is also a piece of propaganda in a way. I mean, there's a lot of unrealistic things here. You would never see any of these ice chunks in the Delaware River. Notice the flag hasn't even been ready, hasn't even been created yet. And keep in mind, this photo comes many years afterwards. You have Washington standing in an unnatural pose. You'd probably fall off. You even have horses back there. I mean, just not realistic. You even have it looking like it happened at the middle of broad daylight. And of course, we know that did not happen. But nevertheless, that's your famous painting there. But at this point, it's going to be very successful because you're going to literally be poking the giant in the eye. And this is showing more of a symbolic victory, that there is hope for the Continental Army. And as a result, they're not going to just stop in the Battle of Trenton, but they're going to go onward toward Princeton, which is right across the Delaware River, not too many days after New Year's. So in January 3rd, 1777, they march from Trenton to Princeton, and again, you have another victory. And Washington is going to descend upon Morristown, New Jersey. He's going to set up his headquarters there, and you can even visit that place in Morris County, New Jersey, where it is preserved, and you see the sign here as well. So again, you have some pretty good victories, bringing some morale back. And at this point, things have been going a little bit better for the Continental Army, but of course that's going to be relatively short. At this point, remember General Howe, he's going to be making a move to capture Philadelphia. And this is going to be quite successful on his part in August of 1777, to the point that Washington not only fails to defend the city, but the Continental Congress actually has to flee. Remember, this is the capital of this relatively, if you even want to call it a country, I don't know that you could, but if you want to, certainly you could. And then once again, Washington's going to fail to dislodge the British in Brandywine as well as Germantown, both in Pennsylvania. So you have this, strategy here that from the British point of view, they want to sort of squeeze out the Continental Army. And you're going to see that this is going to be a two-pronged effort, not only by the troops in Philadelphia, but also with the assistance of Howe in Philadelphia. So again, sort of squeeze them. And General Burgoyne, otherwise known as Gentleman Johnny for the British, is going to try to have that happen with this divide and conquer. And the idea is meet up with General Howe in Philadelphia. Now, this will actually never happen. And it's, of course, because the Continental Army is going to launch essentially a prepared attack against the British, and this is going to happen specifically at the victory at Saratoga. And in particular, as the Burgoyne's troops are going to be making it down to Philadelphia, they're going to be confronted by the Americans, who are literally going to ambush them. And this is going to be a very important ambush, because this is going to allow not only the Continental Army to win the battle at Saratoga, but it's also going to have the effect of getting the French to have more confidence in the Americans. And they're even going to sign a cooperation agreement that is going to allow the French to supply the Continental Army with weapons. They get them to commit. And remember, the French are still angry. They still certainly want to stab the British in the back, because remember, after the French and Indian War, the French were expelled from the North American continent in the Treaty of Paris. So certainly the French are ready to stab their British foes in the back. So the Battle of Saratoga is going to mark a turning point, as you're going to have more foreign intervention with respect to getting foreign assistance here. So that's going to be pivotal for the Continental Army, and certainly that's going to be a good thing. Now, while that was a huge moral victory, you're going to again have some hard times for the Continental Army, and we see this particularly at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. You have wretched conditions. You have soldiers literally dying of disease, exposure to the elements. It was a particularly harsh winter. You even have some resorting to eating shoe leather. I mean, imagine how awful it must be that you were eating shoe leather. And this is as they are waiting for blankets and supplies from the French army. And it's going to be a little bit of time before that certainly happens. But conditions are just very awful. Many soldiers are suffering. They're even getting to the point where they're stuffing their coats with paper, because there literally is not enough blankets for the Continental Army. So again, sort of very unprepared in that sense. And here's a depiction of Washington at Valley Forge and some of the encampments that you'll see here. And you again can visit this in Morristown, New Jersey. Now, another problem that's going to affect the Americans is going to be the problem of paying the soldiers and the lack of currency. At this point, you're going to have essentially hyperinflation, because it's not backed by anything. It's not backed by gold. And certainly, this is going to be an issue as they are overprinting money. Anytime you do this, this is going to lead to massive inflation. Now, certainly, they're going to try to sell bonds to investors and foreign governments, and this might work to a certain degree. But imagine if the Continental Army was to lose. Well, then certainly all that foreign investment purchases of bonds are going to be worthless. And then at the same time, you have war profiteers who are selling goods that are relatively scarce at a very high price, thus making a big profit there. So you had some issues when it came to just simply paying for the war. And the country is going to be heavily indebted following this. But not all is problematic, as you're going to have Haym Salomon and Robert Morris, who are going to basically work together to raise money and pay the troops eventually in gold. Now, Solomon in particular had connections back in the old world, in Europe in particular, who was pretty good at getting investors who were relatively favorable towards hoping that the British were going to lose the war, and were more favorable towards helping the Continental Army. So that's going to be important. Anytime you have a war, they are expensive, and in terms of paying for it, you definitely need that for supplies as well as the troops. And then there's also going to be the human aid here, particularly from the French, as we talked about. There's going to be a Treaty of Cooperation in 1778. And France makes a pretty big declaration here that they are not going to make peace with Britain until the British recognize American independence. That's pretty incredible. And you're going to see the French helping the Americans in the terms of sending supplies, resources, ships, and even soldiers near the end of the war. So that's why the Battle of Saratoga is so darn important. And they also receive additional human aid with the assistance of the Prussian drill master. Remember that the Continental Army is not all that well trained by von Steuben, who's going to be training them at Valley Forge. On top of that, you're also going to receive assistance from Lafayette from the French, spending time also at Valley Forge and also lobbying for more French reinforcements. And of course, that is very, very important. Lafayette in particular is going to use his name and recognition because he's really sold on the fact that the rebels could win the revolution. The French were very impressed at the American will, particularly at Saratoga. So while we are getting to the end of the war, the British are going to shift their strategy toward the South, and it's no longer this divide and conquer strategy. They're going to look to peel off the South and then perhaps employ that divide and conquer type of strategy in the North. So they're going to look at, in particular, Savannah, Georgia, and that's going to be the southern nexus of American settlement and colonization by the British Empire. And it will not take very long for Georgia to be conquered. And then following that, the siege of Charlestown is going to also fall under the collapse, and it's going to be captured by the British Army. And you see that does not take very, very long for that to help. They are even assisted by the help of escaped slaves hoping to get some freedom after in which they hope the British will win. Of course, that does not happen. But keep in mind that Charleston is a very important city. It's one of the only major cities in the South at this time. So the goal here is you've already captured Savannah, Georgia. You're moving into South Carolina. They're heading into North Carolina, and the next goal is to eventually capture Virginia. So it's been quite successful. Now, they are going to get a little bit of pushback from the Continental Army at the Battle of Cowpens after South Carolina is captured. South Carolina will be conquered, but again, the tide is going to come back, and this is going to be the first time that the Continental Army is going to defeat the British in the South, and this is going to be the first step of many towards taking back the South. Again, it's going to prevent the British from encroaching now into Virginia and preventing them from even going into more of the northern colonies at that point. So the South is more or less under British control, but really where this is going to set up is at the Battle of Yorktown, and as you know, this is going to be the end of the war, and essentially what's going to happen is that the American and French forces are going to combine, and they're going to convene around Yorktown. You'll see that the British in particular are going to be surrounded not only by the French fleet, but also by American and French military, if you will. So that is going to lead to the decisive victory against the British General Charles Cornwallis, who was looking to fortify that peninsula. Of course, that is not going to happen, hoping to launch that after that victory to Virginia. Of course, that does not happen by any means, as this is going to be a major victory at Yorktown. So you're going to have, again, the assistance of the French, the Americans working with them, and Cornwallis is going to be forced to surrender. Remember that in many respects, that while the Continental Army was successful in going after the British, I mean, certainly the British could have won it should they put more resources, but they're an overextended empire. They have many colonies throughout the world, and there was not as much of a will to keep it. And you see this will and this confidence on that behalf of the Americans. And it's also to be noted that without the French, you have to really evaluate, would the Americans have won this particular battle? Is it that they really won this war, or is it that the British were saying, you know what, at the end of the day, it's just not worth it? So that's something to think about. We'll eventually have the Treaty of Paris that's going to make a number of land concessions on the British part, but it's not to say that the British will necessarily go away, as we'll eventually see in the War of 1812.